Hello, GCT biology students. Welcome to Module 15. Congratulations for making this far. You are going to be studying the phylum Chordata here, and the vernacular for this is just calling the members chordates. So you'll be studying chordates here. So we'll first start looking at the first 4 characteristics of chordates. That would include a hollow dorsal nerve cord. So you remember from the previous 2 modules that the dorsal part of the organism is sort of like the top of it, and you can see here in blue is represented this dorsal hollow nerve cord, and then underneath it in the yellow you see what's called a notochord. We're going to be discussing what that is in just a moment. And then you see pharyngeal slits or pouches. And then finally here in the posterior end, you see a tail that extends past the anus. So let's look at some of these terms in more detail. So first of all, we look at vertebrae, which is a plural word, which means these segments of bone or some other hard substance that are arranged into a backbone. And we'll be looking at various organisms with vertebrae, and we'll be also looking at this concept of the notochord, which is explained as a rod of tough, flexible material, not bone, that runs the length of a creature's body, and it provides a majority of its support. Many chordates have in their earliest stage of development have this notochord, and then it turns into the part of the organism that's the vertebrae. So there can be various fates or sort of ontological or developmental destinations of the notochord, and we're going to go over these 3 that are here. So the first one is the subphylum Urochordata. That contains creatures that have a notochord in their larval stage, but then the notochord actually disappears in the adult stage of their life. And then the second is the subphylum Cephalochordata. This holds organisms that has notochords throughout their entire life. And then finally, we have the subphylum Vertebrata, which is made of vertebrates that have a notochord during early development, but it turns into a true backbone before the animals are born or hatched. This last phylum is the group is referred to as vertebrates. So all members of this phylum have a dorsal nerve cord, but by contrast, you may remember in our previous module, the arthropods have a ventral nerve cord. I know some of you carefully dissected out that nerve cord from the crayfish, and you found it in the ventral side. So let's look at our first category. We have non-vertebrate chordates, and this is going to include the tunicates, which includes the subphylum Urochordata. So this is composed of chordates that have a notochord only during the larval stage of their development. The best example of this is the strange little sea squirt. It says this interesting marine-dwelling creature gets its name from the fact that in its adult stage, it squirts water through a siphon when it's disturbed. So sort of as a surprise, it will respond with squirting. Some biologists refer to sea squirts as tunicates because in their adult stage, they cover themselves with a leathery tunic that they secrete. In its larval stage, the sea squirt resembles a tadpole. It has a dorsal nerve cord and a notochord. So looking up here in the larval stage, You can see the dorsal nerve cord running here, and then the notochord running just slightly below it. It does swim around for a certain developmental period, and then it attaches itself to something on the bottom of the sea. Once it's attached, the sea squirt begins to develop into its adult form. The nerve cord and notochord are recycled to form new tissues, and interestingly, the organs rotate so that the oral and the atrial openings now point upward, you can see here, and a leathery tunic is formed around the animal's exterior for protection and support. Much like a sponge, the adult sea squirt obtains food by siphoning water into its body through the oral opening and expelling it through the atrial opening. So it would come in through this opening and be expelled in that opening. Phytoplankton and zooplankton that come in with this water are filtered out by the slits in the pharynx, you can see here, and then digested as food. Once again, like a sponge, the adult sea squirt does not move. It's sessile. It's attached to whatever structure the larva choose. Now we're going to look at another subphylum, Cephalochordata. You probably remember from our previous module when we talked about the cephalothorax, that cephalo means head or skull. So we're looking at this organism, the lancelet, and in this organism you can see water is drawn into the creature by the beating of cilia located just inside the mouth. So it would come in this direction. The water is filtered out by these projections called the oral cirri, which clean it of large indigestible debris, for example, sand, so that's not going through its digestive system. As the water passes into the pharynx here, it travels through slits like those of the sea squirt, and the food particles are trapped in the slits, and the water flows out through the atrial into the atrial cavity. So it will come out this way, eventually leaving the body through this opening called the atriopore. The food particles that have been trapped in the slits of the pharynx are sent into the gut, where they're digested, and then undigested, so the gut's here, anything undigested then would be expelled through the anus. Now looking at the subphylum Vertebrata, which includes the vertebrates. It includes many creatures who have a backbone formed by vertebrae from the day they are born or hatched. Now, in our previous module, we looked at the crayfish with an exoskeleton, but in this module, now with the vertebrates, we're looking at an endoskeleton, a skeleton on the inside of the creature's body that is typically composed of either bone or cartilage. So let's look at some details about bones. So it includes many creatures who have a backbone formed by vertebrae from the day they are born or hatched. And as I mentioned, it would be an endoskeleton. The bone is quite interesting. The tissue of bone is composed of living cells surrounded by a hard substance, which is also often called a bone matrix. So even though bone is sort of inanimate, it's surprising how much living tissue it really has. So let's look at these three types of cells in bones. You have osteoblasts, which are immature cells that promote the formation of bone tissue by producing the bone matrix. And they're involved in reshaping the bone during growth or stress, and they would mature into the type of cells called osteocytes. So osteocytes, so this, just looking back here, we have osteoblast. You can see them down in this figure right here at the bottom. Osteocytes are mature bone cells that are surrounded by the bone matrix. So that's them here and here. And they are, as we mentioned first, osteoblasts. Then finally you have osteoclasts, that's the third type, and they would function to break down bone tissue due to reshaping or potentially poor nutrition, and they are shown here. So once again, for the summary, you can see osteoblasts mature into new osteocytes, osteocytes are mature permanent bone cells, and osteoclasts help to reabsorb old osteocytes and reshape the tissue. So looking at this figure of bone tissue, you can see that bones are composed of two different kinds of tissue made of the protein collagen mixed with calcium salts. So we know calcium is really important for bone formation. So let's take a look at this various tissue we have in the diagram here. So you have compact bone tissue, that's shown here, and that's along here. These are calcium hardened fibers, and they're packed together to form a tough structure that is very well designed with absorbing shock. Then we have our spongy bone tissue. That's this porous looking tissue here. They're fibers that are packed loosely and give it a spongy look and provide a structure that's efficient, but it's fairly lightweight compared to what it would be if it was entirely dense tissue. Then for the third type, we have the periosteum. That's here. It's a dense membrane that surrounds both compact and spongy bone tissue. It contains blood vessels that supply oxygen and nutrients to the cells in the bone and nerves. And finally, seen here in this yellowy portion there is considered the bone marrow, which is a soft tissue inside the center of the bone, and it produces blood cells from stem cells, and stem cells are really important cells in our body that can be differentiated into many different types of cells. When considering the human skeleton, it can be classified sort of in two different types of parts of the skeleton. So you have the axial skeleton, which here is represented in this bluish tint. It's the portion of the skeleton that supports and protects the head, neck, and trunk. And it also includes the backbone, the ribs, and the skull. Then in the white, we have the appendicular skeleton. This is the portion that attaches to the axial skeleton, and it has the limbs attached to it. So it has the pectoral girdle here on top and the pelvic girdle here on the bottom. And then obviously you can see the arms and the legs attached in that part of the skeleton. So we're going to take a look at the vertebrate circulatory system. And we know it has a closed circulatory system in contrast with what we looked at in the crayfish in our last module, or some of the insects. We see here this closed system shows you that there is that the network of blood vessels always will be encapsulating the blood that goes through the body. The vertebrate circulatory system begins with the heart, so that's here in this diagram, that may be composed of either 2, 3, or 4 chambers, depending on which organism you're talking about. In humans, it's 4, but we're going to also be talking about fish today that have 2 chambers. The heart pumps blood into the arteries, which carry it away from the heart. And in this figure over here, you can see an artery is represented with this reddish tube here, and then it sort of um, branches off into very small vessels called capillaries, which are so thin, they're just so very thin that the walls of these blood vessels allow the exchange of gases, so that would be oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients between the blood and the cells of the body. And then after the exchange, we have the vein. So the veins are the blood vessels that carry blood back to the heart. So the arteries have the blood away from the heart, then there's the oxygen exchange in the capillary, and then you have the vein carrying it back to the heart. So the book points out that vertebrate blood is red, and it's because the cells that carry the oxygen are full of a protein called hemoglobin that appears red. The hemoglobin in the cells holds the oxygen and allows it to be transported by the blood. And then these hemoglobin cells are called red blood cells, hemoglobin containing cells. And that's what gives blood its color. When the red blood cells have a lot of oxygen, they have a bright red color. And when they're low on oxygen, they have a darker red color, or really more like a bluish purpley tone to them. All right, let's look at the vertebrate nervous system. This nervous system is controlled by a brain. So in our previous modules, we looked at the ganglia, which are just these like little, groups of nerves in the earthworm. But here we have a more developed nervous system that has a brain with different lobes in it. So it says most vertebrate brains are segmented into 5 different types of lobes. So they're going to be explained here. The first here on the left side, we have the olfactory lobes that receive signals from receptors in the nose. So it would be responsible for the sense of smell. Then the next lobe behind that is the cerebrum, and that is the part of the brain that integrates sensory information and coordinates a response to that information. So this would be involved with senses, thoughts, and movements. Then behind that, we have the optic lobe here, the lobes of the brain that receive signals from the receptors in the eyes, so like optician. And then behind that, we have the cerebellum. It controls involuntary actions and refines muscle movement. That's here. And then behind that, you have what's called the medulla oblongata, the lobes that coordinate vital functions. So that would include the circulatory and respiratory systems. And they transport signals from the brain up here out to the spinal cord. It used to be years ago that the right cerebrum lobe people thought years ago that the right cerebrum lobe coordinated responses to stimuli just on the right side, and that they thought then the left just coordinated a response for the part of the body on the left side. However, we have come to understand that there's a much more complicated response than we previously thought. And in many vertebrates, we've seen that the left lobes tend to control the right side of the body, while the right tend to control the left side of the body. And there is just a very complicated interaction between both the lobes. So that's definitely an interesting field to study. People who are more analytical and methodical tend to be considered left-brained, versus people that are creative and artistic are often called right-brained. However, most everybody is some sort of blend of both. So, just to review, the brain, we know, sends signals down the medulla oblongata to the spinal cord, which then sends those messages through the spinal nerves and to their destination throughout the body. And then to break it down into two parts, we have here motor nerves take the signal from the brain and send it out to various parts of the body. So that's going from the brain out into the body. Whereas sensory nerves, mentioned here, take transmissions from receptors that are throughout the body and sends them back to the brain. It allows the brain to sense any changes in its environment and then develop a response. Okay, so we'll talk about reproduction. And in all vertebrates, we know that they're either one gender or another. So it'd be either a male or a female. The male has testes that produce sperm, and the female has ovaries that produce eggs. So fertilization can take place either internally inside the female's body, or in some organisms it would be external fertilization, where the eggs are fertilized once the female has laid them. One way you can tell an externally fertilized egg from an internally fertilized egg is by the presence or absence of a shell. So if an egg has a shell on the outside, then it would have already had to have been fertilized inside the body. So that would be like a chicken or birds. If, however, the egg's more gelatinous, something like a fish egg, that can be fertilized externally. So we have different types of reproduction in vertebrates, and they're all sort of a mouthful to say. So we have oviparous development that occurs in an egg that is hatched outside the female's body. So that's going to be most birds, maybe an alligator or a snapping turtle. Then you have ovoviviparous development. This occurs in an egg that's hatched inside the female's body. So that may include some sharks, fish, or snakes. And then finally, you have viviparous development. That occurs inside the female, allowing the offspring to get nutrients and vital substances from a mother through a part of the tissue called the placenta. All right, now looking at some more detail, we're going to look at this class of agnatha. These are jawless fish. So you may remember when a word has the A at the beginning, it means like without, and so this is like with no jaw. So it's these jawless fish can be found both in freshwater and marine / saltwater environments. So an anadromous fish or an anadromous organism is just one where the life cycle is they're hatched in freshwater, but they can migrate to saltwater as adults and then go back to freshwater in order to reproduce. So one of the examples of this are lamprey eels that live in freshwater. When the eggs hatch, the young are in the larva form and are called ammocetes. When they're in the larva form, the young behave and look differently from the adult, but they can live as larvae for as many as 7 years until a metamorphosis takes place, and then they develop into an adult. These lamprey can attach to their prey with its mouth. You can see the mouth here. It can be pretty aggressive. So I'm going to ask you to think about which delicious fish are anadromous, have a life cycle, which are hatched in fresh water and then migrate to saltwater adults as adults and go back to fresh water. And you can think about it and see if you can pick up the answer later in this presentation. All right, let's look at cartilaginous fish. This is in the class Chondrichthyes. Chondros is a root that means cartilage, and the ichthyes is fish. So these have skeletons that are not calcified. They're not bone, made of bone. And they have extremely good flexibility because they are cartilaginous. So you can see the sharks here. Here's a ray and a skate. We'll be looking at some of these in more detail. So let's look at sharks at first. Sharks have 6 basic types of fins. So we have a pectoral fin, you can see here and here, that's more toward the anterior region, the head. Then it has a caudal fin at the end of the tail. These are the fins most used for swimming. It has an anterior dorsal fin, so that's the one over the sort of the crest of the dorsal area. And it has a posterior dorsal fin used to stabilize the shark and helps it keep upright in the water. Here. The anal fin that's here also helps to stabilize it, and the pelvic fins down here are used for stabilization, and they can also play a role in reproduction. Some cool characteristics of sharks are these mouths. Their mouths are lined with razor sharp teeth, and interestingly, the teeth can be calcified even though their skeletons are not. They breathe through their gills that have capillaries, and even though their eyesight is not especially good, they do have a very keen sense of smell that helps to lead it to its prey. They have a sensitive electric field receptor that helps them detect prey, and they have this lateral line, you can see in this red line here, that helps detect vibrations in the water. Interestingly, in sharks, they may be oviparous, or a few are actually viviparous. All right, so let's look at rays and skates. These guys are pretty flat and thin, and they have their eyes on the top of their bodies. They have blunt teeth and are often called birds of the sea because of the sort of wing-like and beautiful way that they propel themselves through the water. So in contrasting them, the rays have a whip-like tail. They're ovoviviparous, hatched inside, whereas the skates have thicker tails, which are oviparous, and you can see here their tails, and they're hatched outside the body. So now we're on to our bony fish, and we'll look at some of their external features. So first we'll look at the name of their class, Osteichthyes. The Greek word osteon means bone, while we know ichthyes means fish. So they're often called bony fish. Their vertebral columns and skulls are calcified, and their ribs, however, do have some cartilage in them. They have this covering here over their gills. It's called the operculum, and this covering opens and closes as the mouth opens and closes. So when the mouth opens, it will draw in water, and then when the mouth closes, this operculum opens and the water exits. As the water passes over the gills in the fish, oxygen that's in the water is absorbed and carbon dioxide is released. They have a dorsal fin that aids in balancing, and there's the anterior dorsal fin and the posterior dorsal fin. So the anterior dorsal fin may have sort of a defensive, they call it a spine, but it's sort of just like a hook or a barb that can be painful if you grab it. And then finally, to help reduce friction in the water, the fish have a mucus that's secreted from underneath the scales and helps it swim faster. Let's look at some of the internal features of the bony fish. First of all, the tongue on the fish is lined with taste buds. So not only do fish taste good to eat, but they actually can taste things themselves. So the food passes through the pharynx in the fish, which is actually not in this diagram, and into the esophagus, which is here. And so the pharynx would be coming through here, and then the in this gill region, and then it goes into the esophagus and then the stomach. It has what's called pyloric ceca, which secretes digestive enzymes into the intestine and into the stomach. So this ceca right here has the stomach and the intestine. It would secrete into those two organs. It also has a liver, which is connected to the small intestine, and it produces bile. The liver is right here. Produces bile involved in food storage, converts nutrients from one chemical form to another, and cleans the blood from dead cells and bacteria. The bile that's secreted is a mixture of salts and phospholipids that aids in breaking down fat, and it's concentrated in this region of the gallbladder. The air bladder is extremely important for the fish. That's this yellow part here. It helps the fish stay afloat in water because their bodies are actually denser than water, and without that air bladder, they would sink to the bottom. The fish has a brain, that's shown here. It's composed of the lobes, and the olfactory lobes are generally large compared to the brain because the fish have a keen sense of smell. The gonad that's shown here would be a testes in the male or an ovary in the female. And the procedure of spawning refers to when the female lays her eggs, and most fish will have external fertilization. Then finally, we know that fish are ectothermic, which means they're cold-blooded is another way of describing that, and they lack an internal mechanism for regulating body heat. Okay, let's look at this circulatory system. In this system, we know that the red vessels represent oxygen-rich blood, and the blue represent oxygen-poor blood. So the blood flows with a two-chambered heart. The two chambers here are highlighted, the atrium and the ventricle. The atrium is a chamber that receives blood from the veins, and the ventricle is where the blood is pumped out. So it says the blood leaves the heart through a large vessel called the ventral aorta. That's right here. See the ventral aorta. The ventral aorta branches into a series of small vessels. They're called afferent brachial arteries. That's right here, and then they're shown up here. They would supply blood to the capillaries in the gills, and then here they receive a lot of blood as the water flows through the gills. Now the blood is rich in oxygen, and it leaves the gills, let's see the red structures, through efferent brachial arteries. Those are the ones labeled up here. These arteries dump blood into what's called the dorsal aorta. That's this blood vessel here. And that's going to either bring it up to the brain or to the posterior and to organs or the tail. Then oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged through capillaries, and the oxygen-poor blood is carried back to the heart, either in the anterior or posterior caudal vein. So here's the posterior caudal vein and the anterior caudal vein, and then it goes back to the heart that way. So there is quite a bit of diversity in bony fish. There's many different species. There's a handful, only 7 species, that fall in the category of lobed-finned fish, and that would include the coelacanth right here. And then there's a huge variety. The vast majority would fall into the ray-finned fish. That would include examples like carp, salmon, betta fish, spiny fish, butterfly fish, a bunch of different examples. And then to answer my question from previously in the presentation, the anadromous fish that I think is delicious would be the salmon, which, according to this, is also a ray-finned fish. Now you'll get a chance to explore perch through your dissection, and the next step here is to go ahead and watch this video and go ahead and do your dissection.